From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. This week, we're going to look at the still very troubling situation in Yemen. There have been human rights reports issued recently from the UN, much loss of life, but at the same time, Martin Griffiths, the UN Special Envoy, has invited the parties to Geneva on September 6th to attempt another round of negotiations to end the conflict. So sort of despair and hope in the same location. Yemen is a conflict that's been going on 3 to 4 years since the Houthis took over the capital Sana'a in 2014. And then in 2015, the Saudi-led coalition entered, and we've been in battles between the Houthis and the coalition backing the Hadi government there. So a lot going on. We have with us to discuss these issues two colleagues of mine, Dr. Randa Slim, who's the director of our Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues Initiative. Randa also has been a member of the UN negotiating team on Yemen in the last major round that happened in Kuwait. Randa, thanks for being with us today.
Good to be with you.
Randa's usually in Ohio, but today she's in the nation's capital for mysterious reasons. We don't know why.
Well, to do this podcast.
To do the podcast.
But they are all good reasons. Mysterious but good.
Mysterious but excellent. And Ambassador Feierstein, who is a known denizen of Washington, D.C., who is MEI's Director of Government Affairs, Policy and Programs, former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Yemen and follows Yemen very closely, and also runs MEI's Gulf Affairs program. Jerry, thank you for being with us this
Always
morning.
A pleasure.
So, Jerry, let's start in terms of sort of setting where we are in Yemen today, 3 years into the armed conflict, 10,000 people killed, 2 million displaced, cholera outbreak. There's a lot of that going on. In terms of situation on the ground, movements towards the main port of Hodeidah seems to be the flashpoint of this period. Where do we stand in Yemen today?
Right. So fundamentally, as you know, I mean, the situation on the ground has been basically stalemated for the last couple of years. There's been some progress. The coalition has made progress, for example, up in the north in Marib. They've worked up the coast. They took control of Mocha and were working their way up through the Tahama. And the apex of that, the real target of that, was to be this big offensive to retake Hodeidah. And for the coalition and the Hadi government, there was both a political and a military component to what they were trying to do, because their sense was that Hodeidah was the real linchpin for the Houthis, that if they managed to get Hodeidah away from the Houthis, that would be a clear signal to the Houthis that they couldn't win militarily, and that in turn would force them to return to the negotiating table. And of course, this was a strategy that they said they had worked out with Martin Griffiths, who was approving of this. But the problem for them was that it seemed as though they were overly optimistic about how quickly they could get control. And there was also the issue of whether they could take control of the port without also trying to get control of the city. The Houthis have dug themselves in the city and made it very clear that if they actually tried to get control of that densely populated urban center, that it was going to be a bloody battle with lots of casualties, lots of civilian casualties. And for a variety of reasons, I think that the coalition has been reluctant to go that far. And so once again, we seem to be entering into a period where on the military side, there's a stalemate. The coalition has control of the airport, but we're not able to get control of the immediate vicinity, so they really can't operate. The Houthis are still in a position to shell the airport, and the front lines have been more or less static for these last couple of months, which in turn, of course, makes it more complicated for Martin Griffiths, as you said, to bring the parties back to the table and expect a negotiation.
And before getting to the negotiation issue, which I want to ask Randa about, but let me still ask a little bit if you could describe the actual forces. I mean, we speak of the coalition, but who are the forces on the ground taking the airport? And among the Houthis, is it just the Houthis or other forces fighting with them? How would you describe?
Well, of course, the Emiratis are in the lead on the ground. So primarily between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, the division of responsibilities, if you will, is really between the air campaign, which is primarily Saudi, and the ground campaign, which is primarily UAE-led. The Emiratis have a number of Yemeni forces that they trained. There is a Tahama force of people from the local areas. There is also a Salafi force, the Giants force, and some remnants of the Republican Guard and the old Yemeni army, which had remained loyal to Ali Abdullah Saleh and is now being led by Saleh's nephew Tariq.
So how much is this led by the UAE? And how much is loyal and led by the Hadi government?
Well,
or is it a merger kind of?
Well, the command and control is the Emiratis, but the bulk of the fighting is being done by Yemeni forces of a variety of descriptions, under the auspices, under the rubric of being loyal to the government, but really not. I mean, really kind of a mishmash of various forces fighting for their own reasons.
And on the Houthi side?
On the Houthi side, it's primarily the Houthis and other elements that they've been able to bring in. Again, a variety of people who, for one reason or another, have associated. The Houthis have also, of course, been very aggressive in drafting people in, willingly or unwillingly to fight for them. So there were reports early on in this campaign that they were preventing young men from leaving Hodeidah in order to make sure that they stayed and fought for them.
Thank you. Thank you, Jay, for that. Randa, let me turn to you. How do you see the call that Martin Griffiths issued to invite the parties to Geneva? Is it ripe? Is there hope? What did we learn from the last round?
Well, I mean, first, the call is to conduct a consultation among the parties. So we are not even there. We are not officially at the negotiation stage. It's just to test the ground whether the parties are willing to enter into negotiation and resume the negotiations, which ended last time in Kuwait in 2016 without much success. But building on what Jerry has said when he was talking about the fragmentation within each of the Yemeni parties, the Houthi on one side and GPC, whatever is left of the GPC internally, and the Hadi and his
the
allies.
GPC is Ali Abdullah Saleh.
General People Congress, which used to be led by Ali Abdullah Saleh, now has split into internal GPC, external GPC, and within each there are a number of branches. The question is that the conflict in Yemen has become very localized. And so I think Hadi does not, has control over over the territory which supposedly under the control of the legitimate, government of Yemen. And the Houthis, on the other hand, are building very much a police state, but also at the same time, they are losing territory, as Jerry has said. And there is internal fragmentation within the Houthis between those that want negotiation, that want political process, and those that are, the hardliners, the military people. That has been the case in 2016 as a factor that the negotiations encountered as one of the obstacles to reaching a settlement. The other factor that we saw in 2016 is that one side, in this case the Houthis, at the time Houthis and Ali Abdullah Saleh GPC, especially the Houthis, felt that time was on their side. That if they waited longer, then they can get a better deal. I don't think that calculus on the Houthi side has changed. If the Hodeidah operation was supposed or meant to change that calculus and pave the ground for the negotiation, the fact that it is stalled, then that calculus is still
not operational.
It's still not operational. And then I think the third factor that is becoming now more apparent, it was so in 2016, but now, is that the incentives for continuing the status quo, in my opinion, are much higher than the incentives to go peace.
Interesting. Why?
Because there are going to be costs to peace. Partly it's the war economy. Everybody is benefiting from the war.
I mean, everybody meaning those
meaning
parties,
the leaders on
yeah.
all sides, the Yemeni leaders on all sides, be it military Houthi leaders are becoming millionaires, making millions, from the
Controlling
overland
ports and overland
and the
yeah.
overland, trade routes from checkpoints, whatever. And then you have also the Hadi government sitting in Riyadh, sitting in these nice offices, getting nice salaries. If there is a peace process and they're not going to go back, and eventually they will not go back, maybe after a transition period, they have to go back during a transition period. But after that, I don't think the Yemenis will accept them. Then they're going to lose all these benefits. So there is incentives for both, let's say, conflicting parties, the leadership of the both conflicting parties to continue the status quo rather than change and upend the status quo.
You're not obviously very hopeful that this will lead to something meaningful. Let me ask you, what would your advice be to the UN envoy? I mean, is there something he's missing or something that the process could take into account that would give it more hope of success?
Look, I have to say that I know Martin Griffiths personally, and I've seen him in action as a mediator. So if anybody has the skills to do this kind of mediation role in a very, very difficult conflict that is the Yemeni conflict, I think Martin has those skills. And he has been engaged in a crash, learning course about Yemen, the dynamics, and he has been, reaching out to the regional actors. I want to add here that also the regional agendas or the agenda of regional actors are extremely important in Yemen and in the process of negotiation. Yeah. And the importance of whenever you talk about negotiations between the Yemenis to have either a parallel process or going on with the intra-Yemeni negotiation with the regional parties, because they are as influential as
are the regional
intra-Yemeni
maybe
parties.
I'll ask Jerry as a diplomat, where are the regional parties in this process? Are they part of the consultation? Can anything work without them? I guess we doubt that it could. Are they included in the process?
Well, and this is a big issue, and I think that Randa was moving in this direction. And that is, you mentioned it at your introductory comment about the humanitarian cost, about the some of these terrible incidents that we've seen over the last few weeks, the bus bombing and others, where the international community is very heavily focused on the role that the coalition is playing, the Saudis and the Emiratis in particular, in terms of inflicting damage. We've seen the UN report that just came out the other day, which does talk about human rights violations, potential war crimes issues on both sides of the conflict. But obviously, the focus has been on the damage from the air campaign, and the pressure has been coming on that side. But this is a two-sided conflict. It's a two-sided conflict inside of Yemen, but it's also a two-sided conflict externally. And I think that one of the issues has to be bringing international pressure on the other side of the conflict, where, frankly speaking, our ability as the United States to really achieve very much is going to be very limited. But there are others who have a great deal more influence with Tehran than we do.
And by there are others, you mean the Russians?
Well, and I would say in particular, and my advice to Martin Griffiths would be, one, that he needs to be very focused on engaging Iran, and secondly, that potentially the Russians are in a position here to be helpful if they want to be, both in terms of their influence in Iran, but also because the Russians do have a relationship directly with the Houthis. And we haven't really used those links as much as we can for a variety of reasons, obviously, that go well beyond the Yemen situation. But I do think that we need to be talking to them and really to be putting more emphasis on the fact that if we want to stabilize the region, if we want to reduce tensions in the region, Yemen is one place where, at least in terms of the UN Security Council, the great powers, there is no real conflict. We can cooperate with Russia on the situation in Yemen, and I think that we should be pursuing that.
And if I build on what Jerry said and answering your question about advice to Martin Griffiths, I do not see the grounds right now. The dynamics on the ground are amenable to a negotiation,
a real
negotiation, like what happened in Kuwait before in 2016, or what happens with Syria now in Geneva, and a Geneva process or something like that. I think he needs to continue what he has been doing, which is engaging unilaterally, with each of these sides and doing these side negotiations, and then trying to figure out after a certain period of time what is the common ground, and I don't think there is much common ground. After all, the problem of the fragmentation of Yemen is not from 2014 until now. It's well before.
Problem,
That's one of the problem with Yemen, is that this is a country that has always lacked this national cohesion. There is no center of gravity around which you can build this common identity to which these different Yemeni societal religious components around which these components can rally. And that's going to be the struggle. The challenge is, can Yemen be put together? Should that be our objective, of the negotiation? I think we are beyond that. And the question is then what should be the objective of the negotiation? Okay, maybe ending the violence, which is an important immediate objective, but ending the violence maybe while keeping the spheres of influence the way they are for a transitional period. Build confidence. One of the issues that needs to be tackled in phases. One of the issues, and Martin Griffiths has been talking about that, is the issue of prisoner release. I think that will be an important confidence building measure that both sides of the Yemeni conflicts and some of the international actors who have Yemeni prisons in detention, they can maybe engage in to start building the ground for negotiation. So that's why I think he's smart and right in saying this is a consultation, partly because, in my opinion, the grounds for a real negotiations are not there.
Not
exactly.
right. Let me make a plug, Jerry. Can I make a plug?
Sure.
Yeah.
Is this a commercial break?
It's a commercial break to make a plug that MEI is, and you, both of you, are involved in a book project on these civil wars. Jerry's written a fascinating and very insightful chapter on the Yemeni civil conflict that partly began in the 60s, and we have new iterations. And Randa's written also a very fascinating draft chapter on the Iraqi civil war, and there's chapters on Syria and Afghanistan and Libya. So that being a plug for our listeners to watch out for that volume to appear sometime this fall, hopefully. It also explores a bit the links between, these different conflicts. There are regional players involved in both. There are sectarian tendencies. There's militia activities. There's failed states. I won't say more about that. In our final moments, go back to you, Jerry.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Randa's comments, which I agree with completely. And just to make the point that this is one of the challenges that I think Martin Griffiths is grappling with right now, which is to try to define what exactly the objective of this negotiation or consultation would be. And there are certainly people who are pressing him to try to take on all of these issues that Randa cataloged. But personally, I would say that I think that's a mistake, and that if he's going to succeed in this initiative, really he needs to keep focus quite narrow on stopping the violence, ending the immediate conflict, ending the coalition campaign, and then, as Randa said, over time, with confidence building, perhaps with the election of a real government that the Yemeni people can recognize as truly representative, to take on some of these other issues. Because if he tries to do too much early on, then my concern would be that he won't succeed in achieving any of these objectives, and the war will go on.
Let me ask you also, Jerry, I mean, being in Washington here now, the U.S. appointed a special envoy to Syria and is moving on some of these issues. Is Yemen on the White House and and the Department of State's radar? I know the Department of Defense has its cooperation with the coalition. Where does the White House or U.S. policy stand on Yemen?
Well, I'm afraid that it really has not gotten the attention that it requires at the senior levels of the U.S. government. I think, from a White House perspective, the inclination was to simply hand over management of this crisis to Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, and to simply say that we're supporting them. On the State Department level, we really haven't seen direct hands-on engagement at the most senior levels of the department since John Kerry left. Tillerson didn't take it on. I was hopeful that Pompeo would be more engaged than he has been, but I do think that the United States, with the UK, which has the pen on the Friends of Yemen and the Security Council on the Yemen issue, that the US and the UK, with some of our European partners, should be doing more to try to support Martin's initiative and to really corral the international community to be more aggressive in pressing the parties, both inside and in the region, to help bring this conflict to an end.
Thank you, Jerry. Randa, any last reflections before we end?
Yemen is a difficult conflict. And the problem with a protracted conflict like Yemen, with the history of the failed state that Yemen has been, is that over time, the longer the conflict continues, it's going to be very hard.
The harder it gets.
It's going to be very hard to reconstitute state institution. It's going to be very hard to deal with social cleavages, the divisions, the social, divides deepen. And so I'm very worried about how long this conflict and whether this process, if it can succeed, hopefully can put a halt to this deterioration that we have been seeing in the conflict for some time now.
Well, thank you both for being with us today. Randa Slim, director of our Track 2 Dialogues Initiative here and formerly with the UN team on Yemen. Thanks for being with us today, Randa. And Jerry, thank you for being with us, former ambassador to Yemen and currently director of Government Relations Programs and Policy here at the Middle East Institute. Thank you always, Scott Zuki, who directs and produces this program. Mainly thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in. Yemen will be a wound which we will continue to follow and work on for many months to come. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.